02:05 a.m., March 14, 2026. A converted command barge sitting in a sheltered coastal inlet 3 kilometers east of Novorossiysk. Aboard, Russia's Black Sea Fleet operational commander, 47 support personnel, and a communications array that had become the nervous system of Russian naval coordination in the eastern Black Sea. 2 Storm Shadow cruise missiles were already airborne. They had been airborne for 11 minutes. Nobody on that barge knew they were coming. The first missile hit at exactly 02:05 and 14 seconds. The second arrived 31 seconds later. In under a minute, Russia lost its primary naval command node for the Eastern Theater. The fleet commander was evacuated by fast boat before dawn. For the next 4 days, Russian naval operations in the Eastern Black Sea ran blind, a window Ukrainian Magura V5 naval drone teams used to push further east than any mission in the previous 18 months of the naval campaign. This is the story of how Ukraine dismantled a ghost command post that Russia thought was invisible. This is WarVector. I'm your host at WarVector, where we analyze the battles that change wars. And this one, the strike on Russia's Black Sea Fleet command barge, is a case study in how modern intelligence tradecraft turns a hidden target into a confirmed kill. Not through luck, through 11 weeks of methodical surveillance, cross-referenced SIGINT, pattern analysis, and one critical human asset inside the port at Novorossiysk. Let's go back to where this operation really began. Not March 14th, November 27th, 2025. By late November 2025, Russia's Black Sea Fleet had been operating in a state of permanent displacement for more than a year. The Sevastopol headquarters had been rendered operationally untenable after a series of Ukrainian Storm Shadow and Neptune strikes beginning in late 2023 and continuing through 2024. Russian Fleet Command had dispersed personnel across 3 locations: a command facility near Anapa, a secondary node at Gelendzhik, and a rotating forward presence using converted civilian vessels to avoid the fixed coordinate problem that had made every permanent installation a target. The barge concept was, by Russian standards, genuinely innovative. A converted petroleum support vessel, approximately 87 meters in length, retrofitted with a communications suite and a hardened operations deck installed below the original cargo level. From commercial satellite imagery, it looked like a maintenance barge. No obvious military markings, no weapons systems visible on deck, no regular naval vessel traffic in direct proximity. Russian planners had calculated, correctly for a time, that the absence of fixed coordinates in Ukrainian targeting databases would give the vessel operational invisibility. They were right that Ukrainian databases didn't have fixed coordinates. They were wrong about invisibility. Which weapon system proved most decisive in locating this target before the strike could happen? Was it A, HIMARS guided SIGINT relay, B, British-provided intelligence infrastructure, or C, Ukrainian-developed thermal imaging analysis cross-referenced with OSINT? We'll get to the answer before this video is done. But think about it now, because the answer tells you something real about how modern intelligence actually works. The GUR, Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate, began tracking anomalous communications activity in the Novorossiysk coastal zone in mid-November 2025. The trigger wasn't the barge itself, it was helicopter traffic. Russian Naval Command had maintained a courier helicopter schedule that, viewed in isolation over any 72-hour period, looked routine. Viewed across 6 weeks of pattern analysis, it described something far more specific, a recurring rotation cycle, consistent with the movement of senior personnel to and from a location that wasn't any of the fixed facilities already in Ukrainian databases. The GUR's SIGINT cell began correlating helicopter flight paths with encrypted radio bursts emanating from the coastal inlet zone. The bursts were short, typically under 90 seconds, compressed, frequency-hopped, designed to minimize intercept window, standard Russian naval communications security protocol. But the protocol had a flaw. that GUR analysts had been exploiting for months in other contexts. Even frequency-hopped transmissions leave a spatial signature when you have enough collection nodes distributed across the Black Sea coast. By the third week of December 2025, the SIGINT picture had narrowed the source to a 400-meter section of the inlet. That was still not enough to authorize a strike on a potential civilian vessel. Then the human intelligence came through. The GUR's human intelligence network in Russian-controlled Black Sea port facilities had been operating under severe pressure throughout late 2025. Russian FSB counterintelligence had rolled up at least 2 Ukrainian assets in Sevastopol during October and November, creating a period of maximum caution for remaining sources. The asset inside Novorossiysk Port Authority had been silent for 11 weeks, long enough that GUR handlers had begun contingency planning that assumed the source was compromised or inactive. On January 3, 2026, the asset made contact. The message was brief: a vessel registration code, a berth designation, and a single phrase the asset had previously established as confirmation of military significance. Cargo transfer suspended indefinitely. The vessel registration correlated to a support craft that had entered Novorossiysk port in September 2025 under a logistics manifest describing industrial equipment transport. The manifest was false. The vessel had not conducted a single cargo transfer since arrival, and the berth designation placed it precisely at the center of the SIGINT anomaly zone the GUR had been mapping for 6 weeks. The barge was confirmed. Now came the obstacle that nearly derailed everything. The GUR strike authorization process required visual confirmation of an active communications array, photographic or sensor evidence that the vessel was functioning as a military command node rather than simply a dormant asset stored in the area. Without that confirmation, the strike package could not be approved. Striking an unmarked civilian profile vessel without positive identification would hand Russia a propaganda victory that the Ukrainian government explicitly wanted to avoid. Thermal imaging from drone passes at the range required to avoid Russian coastal air defense systems produced imagery too degraded to confirm the antenna array configuration. The GUR needed closer access, and getting closer meant risking exposure of the surveillance operation entirely. The solution came from the Ukrainian naval drone program, a modified Magura V5, configured not for strike but for surveillance, carrying a compact thermal optical payload in place of its standard warhead, was tasked for a night reconnaissance pass through the inlet. The drone ran on battery-only propulsion for the final 4 kilometers of approach, cutting its acoustic signature to near zero. At 01:20 a.m. on January 19, 2026, the reconnaissance Magura passed within 340 meters of the barge's port side and captured 11 seconds of thermal video. The antenna array was clearly visible, active, radiating. The imagery went to GUR analysts within the hour. By 06 a.m. on January 19th, the strike package was formally in preparation. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 8 weeks, and specifically what happens at 02:05 a.m. on March 14th, is the most precisely executed naval command interdiction strike of the entire Black Sea campaign. The British supplied Storm Shadow, formerly designated Scalp EG in French service. Storm Shadow in British is a subsonic cruise missile with an operational range of approximately 550 kilometers, depending on flight profile. It carries a 450-kilogram Broach tandem warhead, a penetrator charge that breaches hardened structures, followed by a main charge designed to maximize damage within the penetrated space. The missile uses terrain-following GPS inertial guidance with infrared terminal homing, allowing it to identify and strike specific structural features of a target, rather than simply hitting a coordinate. This terminal homing capability was central to the strike plan. The GUR's analysts had used the Magura V5 imagery to map the barge's deck structure in sufficient detail to program the missile's terminal seekers against specific aim points: the communications superstructure for the first missile, the converted operations deck for the second. 2 missiles, 2 aim points, sequenced 31 seconds apart to allow the first strike to create the structural opening that the second missile's penetrator would exploit. Ukrainian Air Force Su-24M launch aircraft carried the missiles airborne from a dispersed forward operating base in the early hours of March 14, 2026. The exact launch location remains classified. What Ukrainian General Staff subsequently confirmed is that the missiles were launched at approximately 01:54 a.m. local time, giving them an 11-minute flight time to target at their cruise profile altitude and speed. 11 minutes. Aboard the Barge, Russia's Black Sea Fleet operational commander, identified in subsequent OSINT analysis as a senior flag officer responsible for coordinating naval drone defense and surface warfare assets in the Eastern Theater, was 4 hours into the first night of his 72-hour command rotation. The operations deck was staffed with 12 personnel. The communications watch had just completed a scheduled status check with the Anapa facility. Everything was routine. How many vessels had Ukraine's Magura V5 naval drone program successfully engaged in the Black Sea Theater before this operation? A. 23 confirmed engagements. B. 38 confirmed or probable engagements. Or C. 50 total strike missions launched. The answer is coming, and it matters for understanding what Ukraine did with the 4-day command window the Barge strike created. At 02:04 a.m., Russian coastal radar systems at Novorossiysk detected 2 low-altitude contacts inbound from the southwest. The contacts were tracked for approximately 40 seconds before the operators correctly identified them as cruise missiles. The alert went to the Barge's communications watch. The watch officer transmitted an emergency notification to the fleet commander. The notification arrived 18 seconds before the first impact. At 02:05 a.m. and 14 seconds, Storm Shadow No. 1 struck the communications superstructure at the Barge's stern. The Broach penetrator punched through the deck plating before the main charge detonated inside the superstructure housing. The antenna array, 3 satellite uplink dishes, 2 HF radio masts, and the primary encrypted communications hub was destroyed in the initial explosion. Secondary fires ignited in the electronic spaces beneath the antenna platform. Here's what strikes me about this sequence, and I've spent considerable time working through the technical specifications. How precisely the Broach warhead system performed against a maritime target it was never originally designed for. Storm Shadow was developed in the 1990s for use against hardened ground installations, bunkers, command facilities, bridge structures. Ukrainian targeting specialists successfully adapted its terminal programming for a floating converted vessel, using 11 seconds of thermal drone video as the primary structural map. That's a level of weapons employment sophistication that went well beyond what Russia's operational planners had calculated was possible. Most people assume precision strike systems work because the missiles are smart. What this case actually shows is that the intelligence and targeting process is where the real precision lives. The missile does what it's told. The question is how precisely it gets told. 31 seconds after the first impact, Storm Shadow No. 2 arrived. The terminal seeker had been programmed against the operations deck, the converted cargo space running below the Barge's main deck, where the command and intelligence functions were housed. The penetrator drove through the main deck at an angle calculated to maximize penetration depth before the main charge fired. The explosion vented partially through the portside hull below the waterline. Water began entering the Barge's lower compartments within 90 seconds of the second impact. Damage control teams, 6 Russian naval ratings stationed aboard as permanent crew, activated flooding control procedures immediately. They managed to get 2 of 3 bilge pumps operational within 4 minutes. The pumps were insufficient to fully counter the inflow rate, but adequate to slow it. By 02:22 a.m., the Barge had stabilized at an 18-degree list to port. It was not going to sink, but the operations deck was flooded and non-functional. The communications suite was destroyed, and 7 of the 12 operations personnel had sustained injuries from the second blast. The fleet commander was evacuated at 02:31 a.m. A fast patrol boat, its presence in the inlet not coincidental, but part of the standard rotation protocol the GUR had documented during 11 weeks of surveillance, came alongside the barge's starboard boarding station. The commander and his personal communications officer transferred aboard with portable encrypted communications equipment. The boat departed toward shore at speed. By 03:15 a.m., the barge was effectively abandoned as a command node. The surviving crew were maintaining damage control. The operations personnel were evacuating by small craft, and Russia's Black Sea Fleet had no functioning forward command node for the Eastern Theater. Here's the part that doesn't sit right. Even looking back with the benefit of subsequent analysis, Russia's contingency planning for loss of the barge was inadequate in a way that seems almost incomprehensible, given how many of the fleet's previous command facilities had been struck. The Anapa backup facility lacked the communications bandwidth to absorb the barge's eastern coordination functions at short notice. The Gelendzhik node was operating at reduced capacity due to an unrelated equipment failure that had been logged weeks earlier but not yet repaired. What Russian Naval Command discovered in the 48 hours after the strike was that they had built a dispersed command structure that was individually survivable but collectively fragile. Each node assumed the others were functional, without the redundancy to absorb a sudden gap. Subscribe to WarVector if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because the gap between what military planners assume about their own systems and what those systems actually deliver under combat conditions is where battles are decided and wars are lost. The 4 days between the barge strike on March 14th and the reconstitution of a functional Russian naval command node on March 18th became one of the most operationally significant windows of the entire Black Sea campaign. Ukrainian naval drone teams had been planning what the operational documentation subsequently described as Operation Eastern Reach for approximately 6 weeks, a coordinated Magura V5 patrol series designed to extend Ukrainian naval drone presence significantly further east along the Russian coast than any previous mission. The operation had been held pending conditions that would degrade Russian coastal monitoring and response coordination. The barge strike created exactly those conditions. If you believe that tactical patience, holding an operation until the strategic environment is right rather than forcing it, is how small forces defeat larger ones, type WarVector in the comments. Because what Ukraine did with this window is the operational lesson that matters most. 3 Magura V5 teams launched from dispersed coastal positions on the night of March 15, 2026. The Magura V5 is a Ukrainian-developed naval surface drone, approximately 5.5 meters in length, carrying a 320-kilogram explosive payload, with an operational range of approximately 800 kilometers. It's subsonic, low profile, and difficult to detect on radar at ranges beyond 8 kilometers due to its minimal freeboard and radar-absorbing hull construction. The 3 teams pushed 140 kilometers further east than any previous Magura patrol, entering waters that Russian naval planners had treated as beyond practical Ukrainian naval drone reach. Without the command barge coordinating the coastal monitoring network, Russian response to the patrol was disjointed. 2 of the 3 Magura teams reached their planned patrol positions and returned safely. The 3rd drone was intercepted and destroyed by Russian coastal defense fire at approximately 03:40 a.m. on March 16th, but not before transmitting sensor data about Russian naval asset positions in the eastern zone that Ukrainian intelligence analysts described as of significant operational value. Intercepted Russian communications from the period, fragments of which appeared in subsequent Ukrainian military intelligence reporting, showed the command disruption in stark terms. Officers at the Anapa facility were trying to coordinate with Gelendzhik while simultaneously managing the barge crew evacuation and processing the damage assessment. The communications traffic was fragmented, repetitive, and in several instances contradictory, assets being ordered to different positions by different command nodes that weren't synchronized with each other. One line from the intercepted traffic, translated and released in partial form by Ukrainian intelligence, Describe the situation with unintentional clarity. We are awaiting clarification from the commander. The commander is currently unavailable. At 04 a.m. on March 15th, the commander of Russia's Black Sea Fleet Eastern Operations was asleep on a cot in a facility in Novorossiysk with no functioning communications equipment capable of encrypted naval coordination. The real question this operation raises isn't whether Ukraine was right to strike the barge. The military legitimacy of striking a confirmed enemy command node is not in serious dispute. The real question is what it says about Russian military adaptation, that after 2 years of losing fixed command infrastructure to Ukrainian precision strikes, Russian naval planners genuinely believed a vessel with no fixed coordinates and a civilian profile was sufficiently protected by its own obscurity. The barge concept was clever. The assumption that cleverness was enough, without building operational redundancy into the broader command structure, was a failure of institutional learning that Russia has demonstrated repeatedly across this war. Here's the take that will probably generate some pushback. Russia's Black Sea Fleet should have been written off as a coherent fighting force after the loss of the Moskva in April 2022. Every effort since then to maintain it as an operational entity, repositioning assets, dispersing command infrastructure, building ghost command posts on converted barges, has consumed significant resources and produced diminishing returns. The fleet can no longer operate surface combatants in the Western Black Sea with any confidence. Its primary function has become coastal defense and logistics support. The barge strike didn't break the Black Sea Fleet. The Moskva strike broke it. What the barge strike demonstrated is that Russia still hasn't accepted that conclusion. What do you think? Was Russia's decision to maintain Black Sea Fleet command infrastructure in the Novorossiysk area an example of institutional denial about the fleet's actual capabilities? Or was there genuine strategic logic to keeping the command structure functional, even in degraded form? The barge was still afloat on March 18th when Russian engineering teams completed their assessment. The structural damage was severe, but the vessel was not a total loss. The communications suite was completely destroyed and would require complete replacement, equipment and installation time that Russian estimates placed at a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks. The operations deck was flooded and required dewatering and structural repair before it could be used again. Russian naval sources, citing the minimal military profile of the vessel, initially characterized the strike as an attack on a civilian support craft. Ukrainian General Staff released satellite imagery of the barge's antenna array, the same thermal imagery that had provided strike authorization, alongside imagery of the barge post-strike. The combination was unambiguous. International defense analysts examined the imagery and confirmed what was visible. The destroyed vessel was a functioning military command node, not a civilian craft. Russia's information operation around the strike lasted approximately 36 hours before collapsing under the weight of open-source evidence. The damage assessment, compiled from Ukrainian military intelligence reporting, SIGINT analysis, and subsequent satellite imagery review, laid out an operational impact that went beyond the physical damage to the barge itself. 4 days without a functioning Eastern Command node. 3 Magura V5 teams operating in previously unreachable waters. Intelligence collected on Russian Eastern Coastal Naval Disposition. 1 strike. Multiple operational returns. The total estimated cost of the Storm Shadow strike, 2 missiles at approximately $850,000 each, plus the operational costs of the ISR mission and the reconnaissance Magura V5 pass, came to approximately $2.1 million. The operational cost to Russia, damage to the barge, loss of the communications suite, personnel injuries, 4 days of command degradation. The intelligence value of the Magura V5 Eastern Patrol is considerably harder to quantify, but defense analysts reviewing the operation placed the strategic value of the command disruption alone as equivalent to removing a major surface combatant from operational availability for several weeks. One detail has stayed with me through everything I've reviewed about this operation. The 11 seconds of thermal video that the reconnaissance Magura V5 captured on January 19, 2026. 11 seconds of footage, shot from 340 meters away, on a modified naval drone operating in silence, on battery power through a sheltered inlet in Russian-controlled waters. That 11 seconds, translated into precise terminal seeker programming for 2 British-supplied cruise missiles, is what made the difference between a confirmed target and a suspected one, between a strike authorization and a missed opportunity. The margin between success and failure in modern intelligence-driven warfare is often measured not in armies or equipment, but in seconds of clear imagery. There's one more dimension of this operation that deserves attention before we reach the lessons, and that's the GUR asset inside Novorossiysk port. That individual, whose identity remains protected, spent 11 weeks in a city under heavy FSB counterintelligence surveillance, watching a vessel that everyone around them believed was a routine logistics barge, waiting for the moment when the right information could be transmitted safely. The vessel registration code and berth designation that arrived on January 3, 2026, were the product of that patience and that risk. The Storm Shadow strike would not have happened without that single message. Real battles are decided by weapons and tactics, but they're enabled by people taking extraordinary personal risks in ordinary-looking places. Will Russia successfully rebuild a forward command structure for Black Sea Eastern operations within the 6 to 8 week repair window Russian engineers estimated? Drop yes or no in the comments, based on what you know about Russian military logistics and institutional adaptation. The actual outcome of that question will shape the next chapter of the Black Sea campaign in ways that are still developing as of now. The broader lesson of the barge strike sits at the intersection of 3 trends that have defined the Black Sea campaign since 2022. First, Ukraine's ability to find and strike targets that Russia believed were protected by obscurity rather than active defense. Second, the multiplication of effect that comes from timing a strike to create a command vacuum that other systems, in this case, the Magura V5 teams, can exploit immediately. Third, the compounding intelligence advantage that accumulates when a military builds a culture of patient, methodical surveillance, rather than rushing to strike on incomplete information. The GUR spent 11 weeks building the picture. They had the asset confirm the vessel. They tasked a reconnaissance drone for visual confirmation rather than accepting probable identification. They waited for the right point in the 72-hour rotation cycle to maximize the command impact of the strike. At every stage, they chose precision over speed. The result was a strike that achieved not just physical damage but operational paralysis, exactly the outcome that precision targeting doctrine promises, and so rarely delivers cleanly. The answer to our quiz from earlier, how many vessels had Ukraine's Magura V5 naval drone program successfully engaged before this operation? The correct answer is B, 38 confirmed or probable engagements as of early March 2026. Spanning everything from minor patrol craft to the significant landing ship strikes of mid-2025. The Magura V5 program has been the single most cost-effective weapon system in the Black Sea campaign, when measured by the ratio of strike cost to strategic impact. A Magura V5 costs approximately $250,000 to $300,000 per unit, a fraction of the value of every Russian naval asset it has engaged. The Eastern Patrol series that followed the barge strike added 3 more missions to that record, extending the operational geography of the program in a way that Russian naval planners are still working to counter. And as for our opening intelligence question, which system was most decisive in locating the barge target? The answer is C. Ukrainian-developed thermal imaging analysis, cross-referenced with SIGINT. But the full answer is more interesting than that. The thermal analysis provided the initial SIGINT correlation. The British intelligence infrastructure contributed satellite tasking coordination that helped narrow the search zone, and the HIMARS-guided SIGINT relay, option A, played a supporting role in the radio frequency mapping that confirmed the barge as an active communications node. Modern intelligence is almost never a single system. It's a network of collection capabilities, each filling gaps the others leave. Ukraine's ability to integrate those capabilities has been one of the defining military developments of this war. Now the question's worth sitting with. Was the GUR's decision to wait for visual confirmation before striking the correct call, given that 11 additional weeks of surveillance also meant 11 additional weeks of Russian naval command operating effectively? The analysts who built the targeting package would say, absolutely yes. Striking a vessel that later turned out to be a civilian craft would have been a catastrophic intelligence and information operation failure. Others would argue that the SIGINT and human intelligence together were already sufficient for strike authorization. Where you land on that question tells you something about how you think about the relationship between precision and speed in modern warfare. Could Russia have prevented this? Honestly, yes, but only through a fundamentally different approach to command infrastructure security. If the Black Sea Fleet had adopted a genuinely mobile command structure, rotating communications equipment between multiple vessels at irregular intervals with no predictable schedule, the pattern analysis that identified the barge would have been far harder to conduct. The 72-hour rotation cycle was the vulnerability that SIGINT analysis exploited. Military habits, even when they serve operational security purposes in most situations, create patterns. Patterns create signatures. Signatures create targets. What would you have done differently if you were planning Ukraine's strike on the barge? The GUR chose 2 missiles against 2 specific aim points, sequenced to maximize penetration. An alternative approach, more missiles against a broader target set, would have increased destruction, but also increased the operational signature of the strike and the political complexity of striking a vessel that Russia was publicly claiming had civilian status. 2 precisely programmed storm shadows against confirmed structural aim points was arguably the most defensible approach in both military and legal terms, but it also meant relying on a tight damage assessment, 18-degree list, non-sinking, that came close to producing a vessel that could be repaired faster than Ukraine might prefer. Subscribe to WarVector, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades, not to tell you what to think, but to show you the texture of how modern warfare actually unfolds. The 11 weeks of surveillance, the 11 seconds of thermal video, the 31-second gap between 2 missiles striking a vessel that Russia believed was invisible. The inlet east of Novorossiysk is quieter now. The barge sits at its berth, listing slightly. The antenna masts that once coordinated Russian naval operations in the eastern Black Sea reduced to scorched metal. Engineering teams come and go. The damage is being assessed, then reassessed. The commanders who relied on that vessel are working from backup facilities that weren't designed for the load they're now carrying. The Black Sea doesn't forget what happens in its waters. Neither does WarVector. Real tactics, real consequences. Stay vigilant.